Thank you to the, how many do I need? We'll see. One of these is gin. We'll see how much. I'm just kidding, just kidding. I want to thank the board of the Jackson Family Center for Ethics and the administrators of the center here on campus for this lovely invitation. I arrived last night and I've just had a delightful time talking to folks, and I'm very honored to be here talking to you about marriage equality. Does anyone need a handout? Good. Thank you to those who distributed them so efficiently. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do what philosophers do, and that is I'm going to consider a variety of arguments on the topic that I'm going to talk about. Now, when folks hear the word argument, they may conjure up immediately two folks bickering angrily with one another. That's not what's going to happen here today, at least not at my end. Rather, what an argument is it's a set of reasons given in support of a point of view. We call it a conclusion. And what I've tried to do here is offer, on my own behalf, an argument, you'll find that at the top of the handout, that I have found compelling on behalf of the position that I favor with regard to marriage equality, which is a defense of marriage equality. I think that homosexuals ought to have equal marital rights to those enjoyed by heterosexuals. And then what's going to happen is I'm going to consider 5 arguments. I've reconstructed these arguments on behalf of my opponent, arguments that have persuaded a lot of folks to oppose same-sex marriage. And I'm going to, I hope I've both charitably reconstructed those arguments on behalf of my opponent. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to criticize them. I am going to criticize them. I'm going to try to criticize them successfully. Whether that's so or not remains to be seen. And then I'll just wrap up. So let's take a look first. Pardon me if I seem very professorial here, and let's first take a look at the handout, but that's what I'm going to do. I'm a professor. That's what I'm trained to do. So let's take a look initially at the first argument on the handout, which is the argument that I endorse. And it goes like this. I call it the master argument. The government's morally required to provide all of its citizens with equal legal rights unless there's compelling reason for the government not to do so. And there aren't any compelling reasons for the government to withhold equal marital rights to homosexuals and heterosexuals. And from those two claims, it follows that therefore the government's morally required to provide heterosexuals and homosexuals with equal marital rights. So there are two. So this argument is logically watertight, and by that I mean only this, that if you accept both of these two claims, 1 and 2, then logically speaking, the third claim, the conclusion, follows. It would be irrational to accept both the claims I've labeled 1 and 2, but reject number 3. Okay? So the logic of this argument is good, and anyone, my view, well, anyone ought to accept that the logic of this argument works. The question is really whether or not both of those premises, that's what we call reasons, what philosophers call reasons, premises 1 and 2, whether those are both true. So what to say about them? Let's talk about premise number 1 just very briefly. Premise number 1 encapsulates a view about equality before the law that I take to be at the very heart of our legal system. There's a concern for basic equality that's enshrined in the Constitution and in our many legal institutions. If you think about the basis of all anti-discrimination law, it's something like that first premise, the claim I've identified as number 1. So I'm taking this view about the importance of legal equality for granted. I don't intend to argue for premise number 1 in the remainder of my comments here. We can, of course, talk about this, as with anything else, in the Q&A. So I'm going to take 1 provisionally for granted, and then I think that the real action comes with regard to that second claim, the claim that there are, in fact, no compelling reasons to treat homosexuals and heterosexuals differently when it comes to according them legal marital rights. What I want to say at the outset is that, 35, 40 minutes from now when I conclude my remarks, I won't have taken myself to provide an absolutely watertight, knockdown argument on behalf of premise number 2. I'm going to consider 5 reasons that people have offered on behalf of the claim that there is something importantly different about allowing homosexuals to get married to one another than there is with allowing heterosexuals to get married to one another. And I'm going to try to show that each of those 5 reasons ends up being a poor reason for a kind of discrimination against homosexuals. That said, I want to alert you to the fact that I'm aware that there could be a 6th reason that I haven't considered, or a 7th, or an 8th. And so they're basically, for those who are not sympathetic to my way of thinking here, there are 2 ways of trying to criticize what I'm about to say. One is to say, hey Russ, with regard to your analysis of one of these 5 reasons, nah, no good, didn't work for me, and here's why. An alternative way, if you're critical of my conclusions, is to say, Russ, you've missed a 6th reason, and this 6th reason, even though what you've said is good as far as it goes, doesn't go far enough because there's a reason in defense of the status quo, where by the status quo I mean the status quo, say in South Carolina, where only men and women are allowed to get married to one another, as men aren't allowed to get married to, you know what I mean. But what you could say is that there's this other reason, Russ, that you've failed to attend to. Here's what it is, and then we can talk about that. So what I want to do now is I want to turn my attention to these reasons in favor of the status quo that are meant to justify differential treatment between the marital rights we accord heterosexuals and those we accord homosexuals. The first argument I want to consider, I'm also going to spend the most time on, because it seems to me actually to be at the root of most of the opposition to same-sex marriage. And this is an argument that homosexual conduct is immoral. I focus on conduct because it seems to be that that's what's really worrisome to people. People are not so much bothered by the very presence of homosexuals. I often hear, hate the sin but love the sinner. It's not that we're supposed to outlaw homosexuals per se, as if that is in some way possible, but rather there's a certain kind of conduct engaged in by homosexuals, and of course it's sexual conduct. That's what's at the bottom of the concern here. There's a certain kind of sexual conduct that is thought to be immoral, and it's problematic when the law not only tolerates, but actually fosters the condition and normalizes a condition, normalizes this situation such that we not only tacitly but explicitly approve of behavior that turns out to be deeply immoral. So that's the thought behind this first argument in a nutshell. Let me lay it out in a way that I hope is maximally clear, and that's with regard, and I do that on the handout, with regard to this argument I call homosexual conduct is immoral. It goes like this. The government shouldn't allow legal institutions that are designed to normalize and tolerate conduct that is, in fact, immoral. And gay marriage is an institution that's designed to normalize and tolerate intimate homosexual relations. Those relations are immoral, and therefore the government shouldn't allow gay marriage. It shouldn't allow for marriage equality. Now, what I want to do in this, in analyzing this argument, is focus on that third claim. I want to leave the first 2 claims alone and agree with them for purposes of argument. The second premise seems to be wholly uncontroversial. We could talk more about the first premise, the first reason, if you like, but I'm just going to give that a pass right now and focus on the claim that homosexual sexual conduct is immoral. And we could easily spend 45 minutes talking about arguments for and against this, but what I want to do is I want to identify 3 reasons that of long standing that have been given on behalf of the claim that homosexual sexual conduct is immoral, and I want to reject those arguments. So here are the 3 considerations or 3 arguments given. The first claim is this, that homosexual sex is unnatural and it's therefore immoral. The second claim we're going to consider is this. If everyone acted that way, there would be the end of the species, which is disastrous, and that shows that nobody should act that way. And the third reason is that certain people's religious beliefs regard homosexual sex as immoral. So I'm going to consider each of those in turn, and then we'll move on to the second argument. So as I say, this one's going to take 6 or 7 or 8 minutes at least. So let's talk about the first concern, which is that homosexual sex is immoral because it's unnatural. This is a common thing to say, but, and here I'm going to put my philosopher's hat on. I want someone to define this term, unnatural, because it's an ambiguous term. It has a lot of meanings. One meaning is this. When people say that something's unnatural, what they mean is that only a few people practice it. So what you could say is homosexuality is unnatural. There are only just depends on what your statistics are, only 2% of the population are homosexuals, up to 10%. I've seen data that range anywhere from 2 to 10%. And because it's just a small minority of folks, that's really kind of unnatural and hence immoral. When you think about it that way, I hope it's clear that this understanding of something's being unnatural is not, in fact, a good basis for thinking that it's immoral. After all, I'm not left-handed, but some of you are. And you're a member, therefore, of a statistical minority. Only a small number of people are left-handed. It doesn't make you immoral. Folks used to think that. What's the Latin word for left? Sinister, right? And even, I'm 50 years old. Many of the kids I grew up with went to Catholic school, and the lefties among them still got their hands wrapped by the nuns so that they would change from being left-handed to right-handed. Some of you are looking at me like, some of you of my age are looking at me like, yeah, I remember that. And others of you who are way younger are looking at me like, that's crazy. But that's a vestige of an association between being left-handed and being immoral. So there is a sense in which lefties are unnatural, that in which they're just a small minority of the population, but that doesn't, of course, make them immoral. Being a prodigy and an instrument is unnatural in this sense as well, but of course there's nothing immoral about that. So let's take a different sense of unnatural, and that's one in which, the one that refers to our body, or better, parts of our body that are said to have some kind of innate purpose, some inborn purpose. And the thought is this, that with regard to our sexual organs, they have a purpose for which they were designed, namely procreation. And when you use a body part that's in a way that's contrary to the purpose for which it's designed, then you're doing something immoral. So the thought is that when you're engaged in homosexual sex, you're doing something unnatural because you're using your sexual organs in a way that is contrary to their intended purpose, which is procreation. So this is a perfectly legitimate sense of unnatural, but what I want to say is that using a part of your body in a way that's unnatural, thus understood, is not immoral. This is going to be lost on those of you in the back row, but those of you in the front row, can you see what I'm doing right now? I'm crossing my eyes like that, so that I'm seeing double. What am I doing now? I'm closing my eyes. What's the natural purpose of one's eyes? To see. Thank you very much for the audience participation. Yes, it's to see. But even if I'm knowingly frustrating myself, my ability to do that by closing my eyes, for instance, or screwing my eyes up into the back of my head, I'm not thereby doing anything immoral. What's the natural purpose of your hands? To grasp or manipulate, right? Manipulate from Latin, manus, which means hands. To manipulate, to grasp. But what if I use my hand instead to do this? Am I doing something immoral? No, I'm not doing something immoral. You might also say, furthermore, what's another natural purpose of your sexual organs? An answer that's highly plausible might be to provide pleasure. I'm not going to say anything more about that. I'm just expecting some assent from those of you with some sexual experience. Okay. I'm not going to talk about sex the whole time, don't worry. All right. So what I think is that we've got a lot of reasons to be skeptical about the claim that either there is some unique natural purpose for our sexual organs. It might be to provide pleasure just as well. And of course, homosexual sex can be pleasurable to those who engage in it, as is heterosexual sex. And furthermore, even if we want to say that there's just one purpose to our sexual organs, namely procreation, it's not the case that acting contrary to that purpose is of necessity immoral. And that was the purpose of my screwing up my eyes or closing my eyes, those examples. Okay, so let's take another basis for thinking that homosexual sex is immoral, and that's a very popular test for immorality. I call it the what if everyone did that test. And you've probably used this test. I know I have lots of times. In the face of someone whose conduct I object to, I said, I've done this myself. What if everyone did that? And that's meant to convey a kind of lesson to this person. And let's spell this out a little bit. The what if everyone did that test goes like this. If everyone did X, whatever X happens to be, if everyone did X and disaster would result, then X is bad. X is immoral. So the thought is, if everyone engaged in homosexual sex, then disaster would result because our species would be extinct. Let's assume that's a disaster. I know there's some environmental activists who think that would be terrific because we have done so much damage to the planet. But let's assume they're wrong, and let's assume that the extinction of the species would be a disaster. Okay. So the thought is that if everyone engaged in homosexual sex, then a disaster would result because the species would become extinct, and that shows that engaging in homosexual sex is immoral. What I want to say in response to that is that this test is a bad test of immorality. And I'll just give you one example and let you mull about that. I was talking once to a priest who gave me this argument against the morality of homosexual sex. And I said, well, you know what? What if everyone were celibate? The same result would happen, right? Does that show that celibacy is immoral? No, celibacy is not immoral. But the test says it's immoral. What does that show? The test is wrong. The test is not a good test of immorality. Last ground for thinking that homosexual sex is immoral, and that is the Bible says so. Well, there's a lot to say about this. Surprise. I'm only going to say a very little bit about it. The first thing is this, that I would not stand here and try to dictate to anybody what the proper interpretation of the Hebrew or Christian scriptures is. I know a lot of people of faith who believe in the position that I endorse. A lot of people who say that despite some passages in the Hebrew scriptures, none in the Christian, but some in the Hebrew scriptures, they're often cited in these debates. Nevertheless, the ultimate principles that their religion stands for are those of love, compassion, equality, generosity of spirit towards their fellow human beings. And so, all of these principles and all these virtues lead them to endorse a position of marriage equality. Now, as I say, I'm not a theologian. I'm not here to argue the proper interpretation of some texts over others. What I want to do is I want to issue a twofold challenge, maybe threefold, depending, we'll see. One challenge is this. If you want to justify your position that homosexual sex is immoral by virtue of citing 3 passages in the Hebrew scriptures, then you've also got to accept that stoning adulterers is immoral. You've also got to accept that killing disrespectful children is immoral, because those explicit commandments appear just a few verses before or after the passages in question that prohibit male homosexual sex. There's no mention of female homosexual sex in the Hebrew scriptures or in the Christian scriptures. But it seems to me that, so I don't think that you can pick and choose. If you want to stick with a literal interpretation of a few passages in the Hebrew scriptures as a basis for saying that homosexual sex is immoral, then you've got to stick with a literal interpretation of the surrounding passages as well. But I doubt that many people are willing to do that. The other thing I want to say is this, that when it comes to according legal rights to our citizenry, it's in general a very bad idea to restrict those rights and exclude some people from enjoyment of those rights only on the basis of one specific interpretation of one holy scripture. That's not what this society is supposed to be all about. We have an establishment of religion clause in our Constitution, and what it says is, no religion shall be established. We should not, well, I don't know, I think I'm just repeating myself at this point. If we can't find arguments for legal restrictions that appeal to considerations independently of parochial interpretations of one scripture, then I think that we do not have a plausible public political basis for restricting legal rights. And that concludes my consideration of the first argument. So now on to the second. The prospect of gay marriage is deeply offensive to many people. There's no question that, that the claim I just uttered is true. Many people find the very possibility that we would extend marital rights to homosexuals deeply offensive. And the thought is that we can turn that offense into an argument for the status quo. And I do that here in number 2. Premise number 1 says this: the government shouldn't authorize changes to social institutions if such change would offend a substantial number of citizens, and that's what allowing gay marriage would do. It would be deeply offensive to a substantial number of U.S. citizens, so the U.S. government should not authorize gay marriage. And we can extend this to the state level for many states as well. But let's just talk about the federal things at the federal level. I don't want to deny the second claim of that argument. I know that allowing gay marriage would be deeply offensive to many people. What I do want to say is that the causing of offense is not by itself sufficient for restricting someone's equal rights. We can, and here's a consideration, a parallel that I'll draw on more than once to substantiate that claim. The prospect of invalidating the so-called anti-miscegenation laws was deeply offensive to tens of millions of citizens in the states that had those laws. The anti-miscegenation law, for those who don't know, is a law that forbade individuals of different races from marrying one another. These laws were invalidated federally in the U.S. Supreme Court case Loving v. Virginia, which I think came down in 1967. But one argument that was made by the state of Virginia, which had this law, was that most people in Virginia would be offended at the prospect of an African American and a white person marrying one another, and to show respect for their sentiments, we need to ensure that the status quo, the 1967 status quo, was honored. And what I think is that the Supreme Court did the right thing in invalidating that law, because the offense experienced by a lot of people was based on the following thought, that there's some kind of deep immorality involved in intimate relations between members of different races. I reject that claim, and the fact that many people thought it was immoral back then does not mean that they were right. And what I'd say the same thing, acknowledging my fallibility. I'm not omniscient. I'm limited in my moral understanding and moral wisdom, just like everybody else. But what I'd say is that those people who take offense at the prospect of extending equality to homosexuals are making a moral mistake. They've got some view about homosexuality or homosexual conduct, basically to the effect that it's immoral, which I believe is mistaken. And I've offered a series of partial arguments for that conclusion already. Okay. The other thing I'd like to say with regard to this offense argument is this, that the status quo itself is deeply offensive to tens of millions of people. Were we to refrain from extending equal marital rights to homosexuals, that would also cause great offense. I'm offended, for instance. I know I'm not the only one, by the prospect of withholding a set of rights to a group that has already experienced a great deal of discrimination, opprobrium, condemnation for who they are, that in my view is unwarranted. So that's my analysis of the second argument. Let's move on to the third. And I should say that if you want to know where I'm getting these arguments from, in Wisconsin, I'm from Wisconsin, not originally, but I've been living there for 11 years. Wisconsin passed a constitutional amendment that defined a marriage as a relationship between one man and one woman just a few years ago. And the arguments I'm considering today were all offered on the floor of our state legislature. I'm sad to say, but they were, and they were found convincing by a very substantial majority of Wisconsin citizens, 58% to 42% of those who voted. I think the numbers would be slightly different now, but that's several years ago. Okay, let's take a look at this definition claim. I hear this claim a lot, namely that it's impossible for homosexuals to be married to one another because marriage is by definition a special kind of relation, namely a relation between one man and one woman. So if this is the way marriage is defined, then what you're asking, Russ, and those who are pushing the kind of view that I'm pushing, what you're asking for is really impossible. So just put it aside. You can't ask the impossible of a legislature. You can't do what you're wanting to do. And what I want to say about that is, I think that this argument is really unimpressive, although it has managed to carry a lot of rhetorical power and convince a lot of people. And the reason it's unimpressive is because of a simple fact, and that is that marriage is a social institution. We as a society get to define the contours of marriage. We get to define who counts as eligible for marriage. We say, rightly, that not everyone's eligible for marriage. If you're 8 years old, you're not eligible. If you're, I had an 8-year-old daughter who said, I'm so in love with him, I want to marry him. And I had to tell my daughter, I'm sorry, you can't. And luckily I had the backing of the state. And that was, and not that I needed it, she was only 8 after all. This is a stern-handed parent. But, so what I want to say is that the definitional claim is not persuasive because we get to define what a marital relation is and who is eligible for marriage. It's our decision. And our decision ought to be based on good grounds. It used to be the case, after all, that marriage was defined in many states, not just Virginia, but defined as a relationship between a man and a woman of the same race. That was enshrined in law. That was part of the legal definition of marriage. That was part of the common understanding. If two folks of different races fell in love with one another, they understood marriage was not a possibility. Well, I think that that kind of social understanding of marriage is deeply problematic. And what that tells us is just because a jurisdiction endorses a specific definition of marriage doesn't mean that that definition is plausible. It can be morally problematic. I think a definition of marriage that makes marriage restricted to members of the same race is morally problematic. And I think we can say the same thing about a definition of marriage that restricts marriage to members of the opposite sex. What we need is not an appeal to a definition. My own view is this: invoking a definition never solves a moral problem. It just pushes it under the rug. What you've got to do is ask the deeper moral question. What's the deep moral question here? It's what kinds of rights should the state accord its citizens, and should it make a distinction on the basis of whether those citizens, on the basis of sexual orientation? My answer to that question is no. Your eligibility to be married and to publicly express and to be socially recognized in your expression of mutual lifelong commitment should be independent of your sexual orientation. And you can't say, no, it shouldn't because this is the way marriage is defined. That's like answering a loving couple, one of whom's white, one of whom's black, by saying, no, you cannot get married, nor should you be able to be married, because we define marriage as a relationship between members of the same race. I don't see any morally relevant difference between the poverty of either of those responses. So let me move on to the fourth argument on the part of my opponent, and that's a kind of consistency argument. And basically here, the argument is basically this. Anyone who favors same-sex marriage is, by logic, required to favor polygamy. But polygamy is a bad idea. And so, logically, we shouldn't favor same-sex marriage either. The idea is that these two things go together, same-sex marriage and polygamy. You like them as a package or you dislike them as a package. You can't sever them. So that's the basic idea. The argument, as I reconstruct it, goes like this. It's just from the handout. If gay marriage should be legalized, then we should also legalize polygamous marriages, but we shouldn't legalize polygamous marriages, and therefore we shouldn't legalize same-sex marriage. Okay. Now there are one of two ways to go here. One thing is to say, you know what, polygamy is way better than it's than people have been given it credit for. The women are laughing, but the men are going, yeah, actually, that might be right. But, okay, so I don't think polygamy is a good idea myself. So with regard to the second claim, I'm behind that. I'm not a fan of polygamy. Then what about the first claim? The claim that says, these two are a package. Now, I think that's a mistake. I think we can make we can draw relevant distinctions between polygamous relations on the one hand and same-sex relations on the other. Let's see. How are we doing on time? It's what? 5 of 12? And so how I don't know when I started. How long have I been going? Another 10 minutes? Okay, so I'll talk about this idea then. I've got a little time before the Q&A. So here's what a lot of people think. They think that the case for marriage equality is based on this principle. I'll call it the consent principle, which says that whatever consenting adults do is fine, so long as they don't violate anybody's rights. So the thought is that that's why same-sex marriage is fine, because if two homosexuals want to get married, they're not violating anybody else's rights thereby, so they should be allowed to be married. So let's call that, like I said, that's a kind of consent principle. If you've got the consent of adults, then the law should recognize whatever they want to do. And then opponents of same-sex marriage say, well, what if 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 women consent to being married to one guy? What's the problem with that? Well, two things to say here. One is, if you take a look at my master argument, there is no mention of the consent principle. I'm not relying on the consent principle. My principle is a principle about fundamental equality under the law. So I'm not pushed. Consistency doesn't require me, or logic doesn't require me to accept, polygamy when, if there are such cases, 6 or 7 women voluntarily consent to be married to one guy. I'm basically being neutral here. For my purposes, I don't need to rely on anything like the consent principle in order to establish the position that I'm trying to argue for. That's the first thing. But here's the second thing, which is a little less abstract. And that's the following. There are relevant differences between the institution of polygamy on the one hand and same-sex marriage on the other. The reason I'm opposed to polygamy is because polygamous relationships have invariably worked to reinforce oppression against women. If we can imagine a system in which that were not so, in which, say, an equal number of women got to marry lots of guys, and an equal number of guys got to marry lots of women, and polygamy did not work to reinforce oppressive relations, the oppressive position of women in society, then I might be open to rethinking my view about polygamy. It's not clear what would be wrong with polygamous relations like that. Maybe there are things that are wrong, and I'm just not thinking about them. But it's a different scenario from what we've got in the real world. I'm not thinking now philosopher's hypothetical scenario. I'm thinking about real world. When you take a look at societies that have endorsed polygamy, and you take a look at where women are in the social ladder, they're way down relative to men. So there is an important real-world reason not to favor polygamy, and that's because women are already not the social, economic, and often the political equals of men in most societies now. And allowing polygamy would reinforce the oppressive status of women in that society. But there is no such argument to be made with regard to expanding marital rights to homosexuals. On the contrary, it's just the opposite situation. What we've got with homosexuals is we've got folks who, as a group, have themselves been deeply oppressed. They are the object of continual slurs, informal kinds of degradation, legal discrimination across a number of fronts. That is slowly changing, but it's still the case that, say, a basketball coach at a major college program feels it perfectly okay to belittle his male players by likening them to homosexuals. Insert derogatory slur for homosexuals there. And he's, of course, not alone. He just happened to be caught, and the video went viral. Right? But there are lots of folks who still think it's perfectly okay to denigrate other people by likening them to homosexuals. The homosexuals are not enslaved. There are various degrees of oppression, of course, but homosexuals as a group are oppressed. They are not treated as equals before the law or socially and informally in our society and most societies around the world. So here's an important difference between polygamy, allowing polygamy and allowing same-sex marriage. When you allow polygamy, you reinforce oppression. When you allow same-sex marriage, what you do is you alleviate, not eliminate. You lessen, you alleviate the degree of oppression within the society. So the purpose and the outcome are diametrically opposed to one another. And that's the reason, that's the second of the reasons, the less that abstract reason I have for rejecting the first premise of that fourth argument. So let's quickly take a look at the fifth argument, the idea that somehow marriage itself or married couples are under threat by expansion of marital rights. And the argument goes like this. If a proposed legal innovation poses a threat to innocent citizens and to a long-standing social institution, then it shouldn't be enacted into law. And same-sex marriage poses a threat to innocent married couples as well as the very institution of marriage, so we shouldn't legalize it. With regard to, I'm willing to accept premise number one for right now. Again, this is a premise that can be controversial. There could be things said on both sides of this premise, but on behalf of my opponent, I'm willing to accept it and not push back against premise number one. What about premise number two? I just don't see it. I don't see how it is that I'm married to a woman, and I don't see how the expansion of marital rights to homosexuals is going to pose a threat to us or any other heterosexual couple. But maybe I'm missing something that you can point out in the Q&A. With regard to the third claim, with regard to the institution of marriage itself, I don't think that the expansion of marital rights poses a threat to that institution any more than the elimination of anti-miscegenation laws posed a threat to marriage back in the 60s. What we have is we have an expansion of marital rights. We're allowing more people who would otherwise be qualified on moral grounds. They are qualified on moral grounds, if I'm right, to be married to one another, to have their relationship socially recognized as a marriage. That doesn't threaten the institution. On the contrary, I think it will strengthen the institution of marriage. So I don't find this argument plausible either. So what have I done? What I've done is I've given you an argument based on equality that's meant to invoke a principle of legal equality that is widely endorsed in the society and rightly widely endorsed. If you're going to treat people differently, you need a good reason for doing that. If you're going to withhold rights from some segment of the population, you need a good reason to do that. What I've done is I've canvassed 5 putative reasons that people have offered for thinking that there is a relevant difference between homosexuals and heterosexuals with regard to their proper eligibility for marital rights. And I've tried to show you, I've tried to give you my reasons, at least, for thinking why these sources of opposition are not compelling. I look forward to hearing your thoughts about the matter. Thank you very much.
Why don't you just raise your hand if you have a question? Go ahead. The Supreme Court is ruling, as you know, on 2 different cases. They don't feel that California brings more than enough information to make a justified ruling. However, I am pro-gay marriage, but where do you draw the line? You said it's between 2 and 10% of individuals who are homosexual. If same-sex marriage is allowed, and then where does adoption come into play? Since there's a lack of scientific data, how do we know what the effect could have on children while in the gay marriage?
Thank you. So for those who couldn't hear in the back, the question is, tell me if this is a fair paraphrase, okay? The question is, we're not sure whether 2% or possibly up to 10% of the population is homosexual, and there is a worry about the possibility of allowing homosexual couples who are married to adopt. And since we don't have a lot of data on what's going to happen to the children of those relationships, maybe we ought to be more cautious before allowing marriage. Until when? Until such time as we have the data, but we can't have the data. Right? I'm sorry, go ahead.
What I was stating was that if you allow gay marriage, does that open the door to adoption?
Yes. Oh, thank you. Okay, so the question is, if you allow gay marriage, do you also open the door to adoption? And the answer is yes. As a matter of fact, many gay couples in many states already are allowed to adopt. It's not a precondition of adoption that there be a married couple. Single folks are allowed to adopt as well. So marriage is not a precondition of adoption. So that's one thing. The second thing is, still, we might say there are, at this point, there's relatively small numbers of gay couples who have adopted, whether or not they're married or unmarried. So ought we to not allow those adoptions until such time as we have better data on how kids in those families are going to grow up? Well, I think that's a worrisome kind of argument, because if you don't allow gay couples to adopt for fear that basically for this reason, we need to have lots of good evidence to make sure that the kids in those relationships are not damaged as a result of being raised by gay couples. Then you're never going to allow the experiment in the first place, right? You're never going to be able to gain the data needed if you forbid the experiment from happening in the first place. So you might say, well, okay, let's not allow gay couples to adopt. That would be fine. I think that's a bad idea for the following reason. What we need to do is, if you're going, again, I guess what I appeal to is a variation of the argument I gave as my master argument. In order to say that this group of folks are ineligible for this legal right, namely a right to adopt in this case, not a right to marry, you need to have a really strong, I call it compelling reason to show that they ought to be treated differently from others. The fact that we haven't done it before is not by itself a compelling enough reason to to withhold this kind of important right, the right to be a parent. Right? That's one thing. The second thing is this. There's a lot of data out there about the comparative welfare of children raised as adopted children as opposed to, quote, natural children. Okay? I don't really like that terminology, but you understand what I mean when I use this distinction, adopted versus non-adopted children. Okay? And what this data shows is that if you are the child of adoption, you are 5 times less likely to suffer child abuse because your parents have made a very conscious decision to have a child. They haven't been forced into this situation through any number of exigencies. They have made a conscious decision to have a child by means of adoption. Now, the exact explanation for why this great disparity in the rates of child abuse between adopted children and non-adopted children is something that I'm going to leave to the social scientists. But what I want to say is that given the data that we have right now, that adopted children on the whole fare better, controlling for everything else, okay, which is tricky, but on the whole fare better than do non-adopted children, leads me to think that absent some compelling argument, we should expect the same thing for children who are adopted and raised by gay parents.
Thank you.
If I'm not mistaken, Title IX prohibits discrimination based on gender, race, sexual orientation. If I were to do something to someone who is homosexual based on that, it is considered a hate crime, and I suffer further penalties based on that. How can denying, or shouldn't denying gay marriage based on this fact not be considered a hate crime? Can the same logic apply?
I have never heard that question. So kudos to you. Well, the short answer is no. Next question. I'm just kidding. It can't. I mean, this is a kind of weaseling out of. But let me weasel out, and then you can push back if you want. It can't be considered a hate crime because a crime is defined as, at a minimum, a violation of existing law, right? And when the existing law reinforces this kind of differential treatment, then those who enforce that law are not they're not, by definition, violating that law, and so they can't be committing a crime. So that's a kind of weaselly way of answering your question. If instead what you're asking is, morally speaking, aren't those who uphold the status quo effectively guilty of perpetrating kind of hate crime, but because what they're doing is they are violating the rights of an innocent, and in so doing, sending a message of inferiority that is unmerited. And so reinforcing existing stereotypes and oppressive relationships. And that's the basis of our hate crime legislation. Right? And what I would say is that although there are many well-intentioned people on the other side of this debate, that the effects of what they are doing are similar to the effects that occur in certain hate crimes. Okay? I mean, there are some hate crimes, for instance, battery. We're not talking about that here, right? But the similarity exists in the following sense, namely that those who are trying to uphold the status quo are, whether they intend to or not, sending a kind of message of inferiority that reinforces existing kinds of discrimination, both formal, as enshrined in the law, and informal. So there is that similarity.
Many people who oppose gay marriage do so on a states' rights basis. They say, New York wants it, let them have it. North Carolina doesn't, they should. And it looks like from the commentators, the Supreme Court will side with that. They will kick it back to the states. With reference to that, how do you feel? Is it a geographical issue, or is it something does it matter where you fall in love at, which state, whatnot? But how does, and that's more of a legal question, but how does that come out? Like, basically, what would you apply to this person who says it's a states' rights issue and not an issue?
Thanks. So the question is, should this matter be delegated to the states? Is this a states' rights issue where what we should allow is what we allow right now, which is a state-by-state decision on things? And my answer is that I don't think it's properly a states' rights decision. I don't think that we should allow each individual state to determine for its citizens, to determine for themselves whether marriage equality is popular enough or not. Why? Because I think that having a right to be married is a fundamental right. It's a deeply important right. It's not a superficial one. It's not like a right to drive isn't a fundamental right. It's important, but it's not really at the core of who we are as citizens and as moral persons. But I think that a right to determine for yourself who your life partner is going to be and have that socially recognized goes deep. That is a serious, important right. It's never mentioned in the Constitution. Do we have it nonetheless? Yes, this is one of our unenumerated rights. It would be wrong for states to say, hey, guess what? No one can get married. I think it would be wrong to do that. So if the right to be married is an important moral right, then like other important moral rights, it should not be left to the whim of the voters. We offer certain protections to people. We assign certain rights to our citizens uniformly, regardless of which state they happen to live in or originate from, because these rights are so important that they should be immunized from the political process. I think that marriage is one of them. And if that's so, then it oughtn't to be up to each, it oughtn't to be, and whether you enjoy marital rights should not be a function of an accent of where you happen to live or what the latest vote happens to be. So I don't think it's properly, because it's such an important right, I don't think it's properly a states' rights issue.
That young man in the back just had his hand up for the longest.
All right, why don't we wait for the president?
What? Not the other one.
Okay. All right. Let's fast forward several. However long it takes for the government and everything to fall into to make marriage equality happen. Do you think that that individuals should reserve the right to sue private churches for refusing to marry them within the walls of their churches in front of their congregation? That's the first question. And number two, what would you say to all of the taxpayers who have values that are contrary to what yours are, that don't want to see a normalization of homosexuality take place in public schools that their hard-earned tax dollars go to support?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so could you hear both of those questions over there? Yeah, okay. So the first question just escaped me. Tell me again. Oh, the church question, yeah. No, I don't think that anyone ought to have the right to sue a church for refusing to grant them a marriage license or approve of their marriage. No. If you belong to a church like that and you're a homosexual couple and your church says, I'm sorry, we're not going to license that, you're at liberty to find another church. I don't think that there's a good basis for a suit in that case. The second case, that of the taxpayers who oppose same-sex marriage, what would I say to them? What I say to them is what I say to anybody in similar situations. Namely, we're taxpayers. Not all of our taxes are going to go to things that we endorse. We're citizens of the same union, and it's a democratic union that has a set of rights that is protected from democratic decision making, admittedly. But if you don't like the way your tax dollars are spent, then lobby to change the way that they're spent. But we don't, as taxpayers, have discretion to say, my tax monies can only go to this, this, and that, because I don't like that. There's a lot of things my my state government and my federal government do that I don't like, and that's through Democratic regimes and Republican regimes. And I'm no different from anybody else. I don't know anybody who's 100% behind what their legislators are doing at any time. But we don't have the right to determine as individuals what's going to be done with our tax dollars, to the extent that we can say, sorry, the state's supporting something I don't like, therefore I don't have to pay taxes. No, you got to pay taxes. If you really don't like it here, then you can move somewhere else.
More about what happens in schools, what it's
Oh.
fair to our children and everything else.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so, good. Okay, so with regard to what happens in our schools, I don't have really well-defined ideas about exactly how much local autonomy there ought to be in schools. On the one hand, I like the idea of having federal standards. On the other hand, having a federal Bureau of Education effectively has largely been a disaster, I think, and a waste of tens of billions of dollars. That's my own personal view. That said, I think that it's nevertheless important. Let's take a parallel case, which I keep coming back to. I think it's important if the case I've made is correct, it's important that students in all areas of the country, even areas where, and perhaps especially in areas where marriage equality is unpopular, it's important that students be exposed to the possibility of marriage equality and the arguments of the sort that I've just given, and there are many more, of course. So, because what's education about? No, I'm not going to answer that question with one sentence. But one important thing about educating our kids is getting them to see that the viewpoint that they've been raised in, either just by their parents or by their local community, that there are other viewpoints out there. I think it does children a disservice as they are maturing and growing into adults to give them only a single point of view and prevent them from experiencing any other kind of view. So I do think that I don't think that everything ought to be on the table. I don't think that kids ought to be taught racist lessons side by side with lessons that talk about equality, because we have excellent reason for thinking that racism is wrong. But I think that we have equally excellent reason for thinking that the current kind of discrimination, or if just to put it non-tendentiously, neutrally, the current kind of differential treatment accorded to homosexuals is also wrong. And if that's so, then I think that ought to get into the textbooks.
Okay, I think we're done with questions, unfortunately.
Oh.
Thank you all so much for coming this afternoon. We know that you will leave with plenty to think about, and we appreciate you being here. And thank you, Russ.
Thank you all very much.